the Tractate of Megillah. Let's bring up the text. Again, we're going to be learning out of Rabbi Steinsaltz Even Yisrael's English online version with the Rashis and commentary that I'll add in on the side. Just going to do quickly. Okay, so quickly we're going to start the intro there. The intro, okay, we're starting. So Megillah is in Masechta. Hey Avi, welcome. Mazel tov, Masechta. So it says like this. Therefore, he's quoting from the Megillah itself. So Megillah Esther. We're going to learn throughout. We start off with the laws of reading the Megillah, but throughout the tractate, we're going to go into the story of Purim as well. So it says, therefore, the Jews of the villages who dwell in unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day and of sending portions to one another, which is the Mishalach Manas. And Mordechai wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Achashverosh, both near and far, to enjoin them that they should the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same in each and every year as the days in which the Jews Heishuki rest from their enemies, and the month that was turned for them from sorrow to gladness and from mourning into a good day. That they should make them days of feasting and gladness and sending portions to one another and giving to the poor. So these are the four mitzvahs. These are the four mitzvahs of, this is all quoted from Esther 9, which is the end of the story. Hey, Ariel, welcome, and Shuki, New Masechta. So we're just doing the quick intro from Rabbi Steinsaltz. He quotes from the Megillah the idea about the difference between the walled cities and the unwalled cities if we celebrate the 14th or the 15th of the day of Purim. Meaning to say, the question we're going to see that we analyze is first of all, the first Mishnah goes into the different laws of when we read the Megillah. And the question is also what's the foundation for the separate days of reading, and of course we're reading like Hanukkah, we read on the day after. So the question is, the 13th was the final day of war in the cities outside of Shushan, right? So we had the city of Shushan that fought one more day, right? The Megillah clearly says that Esther asked one more day for the Jews of the city of Shushan to be able to fight. So the people of Shushan, which is the capital of the empire of King Achashverosh, hey Bruce, welcome, they fought one more day. So the people of Shushan fought one more day. So therefore they only rested on the 15th because they were fighting on the 14th. The rest of the Jewish people across the provinces of Achashverosh, meaning throughout the Persian Empire, they completed their fighting on the 13th, so they rested on the 13th, so they rested on the 14th. Now the question is based on that fact that there was 2 days of resting, how do we establish the holiday? So that's what we're going to kind of go into, and a little bit the commentaries, it's not so clear of if what we learn in the Mishnah is agreed upon in other sources of Torah, like the Medrash, etc. But let's just finish the intro, we might as well. The Jews confirmed and took upon them and upon their seed, this is all quoting from Esther, and upon all those who joined themselves, meaning the converts to them, and it shall not pass that they would, and it shall not pass that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing and according to their time in every year, and that these days should be remembered and observed throughout every generation, means to keep the holiday of Purim. Every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not cease from amongst the Jewish people, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. So this is the idea of Esther. So this is 9:19, chapter 9:19, and chapter 9:27. So Mordechai established the holiday, and the Jewish people accepted upon themselves the holiday. Just this line that it says that Purim should not cease from among the Jews is the basis for how we know that Purim is one of the holidays that will not cease even in the times of Mashiach. There's a question if what holidays will be celebrated in the days of Mashiach. It's clear Purim, and then according to most opinions, Hanukkah will also be a holiday in the times of Mashiach. Okay, that's the idea that and that's hinted in the Megillah that says Purim shall not cease among the Jewish people. Okay, So he says like this, from the time of the origin of the holiday of Purim has always been celebrated at different times and different locations. As the Megillah itself states, only the Jews of the villages that dwell in unwalled towns celebrate Purim on the 14th, which is known as the regular Purim of Adar, which is in the month of Adar. On the other hand, residents of walled cities, and this is still today, like Jerusalem, we'll see in a second, is considered a walled city, celebrate Purim on the 15th of Adar. Additionally, in ancient times, the sages instituted that the Megillah may be read, the Megillah. It doesn't. You have to remember there's two separate ideas here. There's one is the reading of the Megillah and the celebration of Purim. It's not the same thing. For instance, we have even till today times that we read the Megillah at a different time of celebration. For instance, in Jerusalem, we could still, or in the 15th could still fall out on Saturday. The 14th today, according to our calendar, will never fall out on Saturday. So it's not possible for people who live outside of the walled cities to experience what we call a 3-day Purim, because Purim will never fall out according to the set calendar on a Saturday, on a Shabbos Kodesh. However, in Eretz Yisrael, in Yerushalayim, till today, the 15th, quite often falls out on Shabbos, I think in an unproportional amount of times. So, which means that we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos. We'll see why. So we read the Megillah on Thursday night, Friday. And the question is, but it doesn't mean we celebrate Purim on Thursday night, Friday. We celebrate Purim, parts of Purim on Shabbos and parts of Purim on Sunday. So too, in this additional ancient time sages instituted, the Megillah may be read by residents of some locations at other times. Doesn't mean that they celebrated Purim on those times. It just means that they read the Megillah on those times. The residents of villages were permitted to advance the reading of the Megillah to a day in gathering the Monday or Thursday preceding the 14th of Adar. We're going to see in a second what's the definition. That they would come in, the people who lived in small villages where there were no minyanim, there were no congregations, so they couldn't rely on a local synagogue because they didn't live in a local community. They would gather into the cities on Thursdays and Mondays. We'll see why, for various reasons, whether it was for business or also just to listen to the Torah. Not also, just, but that was part of the Dakan of Ezra was to listen to the Torah twice a week, aside for the Shabbos and Mincha, and therefore they would read the Torah. They would come into the minyan for Thursdays and Mondays. So if they're already coming into this community, to the minyan, on Thursdays and Mondays, the rabbis allowed them to do the Megillah as well at that time, because otherwise they wouldn't have a minyan. That's the basic understanding. The allowance was made for the benefit of the villagers who would customarily travel to large towns on these days, meaning Mondays and Thursdays, when the courts were in session. So one reason is that if they needed to go to courts, the courts were in sessions. The markets were open for business. The Torah was read during the prayer service. Again, so there's Torah, courts, and business, meaning the markets. Chapter 1 addresses the details of this institution. That means the idea of when do we read the Megillah, as well as related topics such as when to read the Megillah when Purim occurs on Shabbos. This chapter will also clarify the criteria for walled and unwalled cities with regard to reading the Megillah. This includes a description of the physical characteristics of a walled city, as well as the discussion of when the city needs to have been surrounded by a wall. It means if I have a walled city today, a walled city, is that considered, do they read on the 15th? Or what's the date that establishes a walled city? And does the wall still have to be standing? In order for the Megillah to be read there on the 15th of Adar. As a continuation of this discussion of when to celebrate Purim and read the Megillah, this chapter also includes summary of the differences between the first and second month of Adar with regard to both the reading of the Megillah and other mitzvahs of Purim, meaning sometimes we have a leap year and there's 2 others, right? If we have a leap year, the month that has 2 months in it, we don't have a 13th name. There's Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni, and the month of Adar. Following this Mishnah, the chapter includes several other Mishnayos that follow a similar structure, which is there's no difference between A and B except for C. Means say other subjects that are not really connected to Purim at all, but that's the Mishnah. Once we're talking about separating ideas, so we're going to go into other halachas that have nothing seemingly to do with Purim. These Mishnayos are related to the previous Mishnah in form, although they're not thematically connected to the rest of the chapter or to each other. Finally, the chapter includes extensive Agadic expeditions of numerous verses from the Megillah. So again, we're going to explain some parts of the Megillah. Okay, so now we're starting the first Mishnah. The Megillah typically is not a difficult Masechta. My friend Srili, shout out to Srili, who does Daf Yomi online, great guy here in Yerushalayim. I asked him for suggestions, so he said Megillah is a great Masechta, but it's also a little lighter than, let's say, Sanhedrin, what we learned last time. But the first Mishnah says a lot of commentary because there's a lot of questions about the law that we discuss here about how we celebrate and what's the idea of Purim. So we're going to try to put in as much as we can. It seems to be much more of halachic insight than we had maybe in Sanhedrin, because a lot of these questions are actually questions that apply to us when we celebrate Purim. So the Mishnah says like this: Megillah Nikreis b'chadasar. The Megillah can be read on the 11th. So the earliest day, the Megillah can be read in the month of Adar systematically. We'll see that our opinions, even for the Megillah, has an opportunity to be read throughout the whole month of Adar in extreme situations where you're going to be where you can't read the Megillah on these days. But we're talking about systematically, the Megillah may be read on the 11th, B'Shnei Asar on the 12th of the month, B'Shlosh Asar on the 13th of the month, B'Arba Asar on the 14th of the month, B'Chamisha Asar on the 15th of the month. So we have 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 5 days. The Rokeach says that the 5 days are corresponding to the 5 times the word Purim is in the Megillah. But that's it. The expression we'll learn, is not typical. It should say, Leipachas really means not less or not more. It should really say not earlier or later. So the words pachas and yaiser are not exactly the typical term we would use, but we'll see why. Cities that, Krachim are cities that have been walled from the days of Joshua, meaning Yeshua ben Nun is the conqueror of Eretz Yisrael, the successor of Moshe Rabbeinu when the Jews entered the land. That defines a city that's been walled, a city that was walled in the days of Joshua. Karim b'chamisha asar, they read on the 15th. Okay, so meaning to say that today everyone knows Yerushalayim as a walled city, but the Yerushalayim is not really a walled city. The walls of the city of Yerushalayim were not built by the first temple or the second temple or Herod. The walls, most of it, the walls of the old city today of Jerusalem were built by the Sultan of Turkey in the year 1500 or so. So it's not the walled city of temple times or biblical times, but it was a walled city in the times of Joshua. We know that the Jewish people, when they conquered Yerushalayim, King David, it was not an easy city to conquer. So the Yerushalayim was a walled city in Jerusalem time. And the reason why seemingly Yeshua ben Nun has nothing to do with the story of Megillah, right? Yeshua ben Nun conquered Eretz Yisrael close to 900 years before the story of Purim, right? When did the story of Purim happen? The story of Purim happened between the destruction of the first and second temple, when the Jewish people were exiled into Babylonia, and then it was conquered by the Persians. Achashverosh was one of the Persian kings. And that's when the story of Haman and the destruction, the scheme to destroy the Jewish people happened. So Yeshua ben Nun and you have to remember, the Jewish people in the time of the judges, the temple was only built by Solomon in 400 years after the Jewish people entered the land, 300 and something years. And then it stood for 400 years. And then they were in exile for about 40, 50 years until the story of Purim. So the story of Purim happened 800, 900 years before, after Joshua walked in. So what's Joshua have to do with the story of Purim? But the reason is because at the time that Purim was instituted, Jerusalem was destroyed. Eretz Yisrael was already after the first return of the Jews with Zerubbabel, but there was no institutions, there was no walls yet. They tried to build the walls. It was not a city of glory. And in order that it shouldn't shame Jerusalem, that Jerusalem would be keeping on the 14th, and the capital, the Washington of the time, Shushan, will be keeping on the 15th, that wasn't respectful. So they decided that what's going to institute the 15th is a walled city from the days of Joshua. That's the typical explanation. Other reasons given is because we have to have a makar in Torah, and there are other laws that are connected to walled cities. Like when we sell a house, if it's a house in a walled city, if you're a property, when you could redeem it and go back to the laws of pidyon, of redemption, Ir Chayma. And so therefore, we just like in Ir Chayma, what establishes a city of a walled city is when the city was walled by Joshua. So too, Purim, to connect to a mitzvah, is also defined by a walled city by Joshua. And there's other questions. The questions is, what about the walled cities outside of Eretz Yisrael? I don't know. I'm not familiar with the geographic, but if there's a city today, there's Jewish communities all over the world. And if places in China, Japan, Australia, I mean Australia not, but the places like in Asia, Turkey could be places where there was walled cities in the times of Joshua. Do they keep on the 15th or not? We don't find that anyone keeps the 15th out of Eretz Yisrael. So there's a discussion by the commentaries. If the walled city in the times of Joshua is only cities in Eretz Yisrael or not, and Shushan, where the story happened, which is the capital of Persia of the time. Okay, so they read on the 15th. Kfarim v'ayirares, other cities and villages, Gedailos, large cities, Karim Barbasa, they read on the 14th. So in theory, there's only 2 times to read the Megillah. 15th and the 14th, which is the custom today. We either have Purim on the 15th, and you have to remember something else. Again, there's reading the Megillah and celebrating Purim. Today, on a non-Shabbos 14th or 15th Purim, let's say a Tuesday and a Wednesday, the Tuesday is the 14th, Wednesday is the 15th. So Purim is celebrated in its completion on the 14th for anyone outside of a walled city. And on 15th, in completion, whoever lives in a walled city, which means all the 4 mitzvahs of reading the Megillah, of sending gifts to the poor, and Simchas Yom Tov, and the reading of the Megillah, of the Torah, of Malik, all that stuff happened on the 15th. Whoever celebrates on the 14th happens on the 14th. But now we're going to say that there's another opportunity to read the Megillah for those who don't live in large cities. The people who live in villages, Magdimim, they could read the Megillah. Again, that has nothing to do with the celebration of Purim, the Yom HaKnisa, to the day of gathering. What's the definition of day of gathering? We're going to see. All right, let's learn Rashi. Masnisim Megillah Nikreis b'Yudalef Pa'amim Bezel L'Kamam Farish V'Azel. Sometimes the Megillah is read on the 11th, and sometimes it's read on other days, and we're going to explain when. Leipachas v'Yaser, Leipachas, not earlier. Pachas means less than the 11th. V'Yaser mitesvav, you can never read past the 15th. Never in a scheduled way. Mimais Vishua, the Gemara is going to explain what's it have to do with Joshua. Here the Rashi says, the villages are able to read the Megillah on the day of gathering. Klomar, meaning to say, we just said that cities that are walled will read the Megillah on the 15th. V'shein mukafim, and those that are not walled, karim b'yudal, on the 14th. Harei kol b'chlal, that includes all cities, anywhere you live. Either you live in a walled city or you don't live in a walled city. So how do we have 11, 12, and 13? Either and there's a discussion. What about a village that's been walled since the times of Joshua? It's a possibility. You have a tiny village, but it's a village that's been walled. What would be the law then? So we'll see that in a second. So he says, so what's 11th, 12th, and 13th? So he answers, the villages, Nasnulem Chachamim, the rabbis, instituted and gave them permission, Lahagdim Kriyase Liyom HaKnisa, again, to read the Megillah on the day of gathering, which is Yom Sheni B'Shabbos Shulfnei Yudalad, on a Monday before the 14th. So if the 14th were to fall out on Tuesday or Wednesday, so you could read on Monday. If it falls out on Thursday, you read Bo B'Yom on the day. O Chamishi B'Shabbos, or they would read it on a Thursday if Purim were to fall out, in theory, on Friday or Shabbos or Sunday. Okay, is Yom Chamishi B'Shabbos Shu Yom Knisa, a day of gathering, Shakfar Miskansin Layaris, because that's a day when the people of the village go into the cities. Why would they go to the cities on a Monday or on a Thursday? For a mishpat, if they have any kind of court proceedings. The custom was that courts were open on a Monday and a Thursday. Ketakanas Ezra, as Ezra says, and is brought down in the Gemara Baba Kama. And so here's Rashi says his opinion. This is where Rashi goes in. Why can't he just read in the village? So he says because the people who live in the village, Nikreis, they couldn't read, they weren't educated. They didn't know how to read the Megillah. Someone had to read it for them. Someone in the city. I was telling someone who called me up recently and says he needs a Chabad. It's a custom that if you're in Avelis, if you're in the year of mourning for your mother or father, so it's customary to try to get maftir, try to get the maftir on Shabbos. It's not everyone has that. In Chabad, they're strict with that. So I told him, I said, it's not easy because there's locals who have to get maftir. So I said, listen, I have a minyan that I know. That's an 8th minyan. That's an early morning minyan. The only thing is that in Jerusalem, they have a custom. I have never seen it outside Jerusalem, so it could be outside Jerusalem as well, where they read the Haftorah on Shabbos out of a Megillah, or a scroll. It's not a Torah scroll, but it's a Navi scroll, which means it's written without nikudos and without notes. So if you don't know how to read without nikudos, without the vowels or the notes, so how could you get maftir? So what they do is they call you up for maftir, and you read the blessings, but someone else, the Baal Korah, reads the maftir because you can't read it. So the same thing is in the villages. We know that until today, there are only a handful of people who know how to read the Megillah. And it's more unlikely for that person to be living in an isolated area, in a kfar, in a city, in a village, where in the city you usually have someone who knows how to read the Megillah. So the people of the village don't know how to read the Megillah. So typically, they need someone's going to read it for them. Someone from the city. And therefore the rabbi said they're not going to make them come a 3rd time in the week, which is the 14th itself. And depending on what day Purim is, so the Monday or Thursday could either be the 11th, the 12th, or the 13th. So therefore they could read it on the 11th. And again, if Monday or Thursday were to fall out on the 14th, so then they would be there anyways. Okay, let's see what Rabbi Steinsaltz says. Then I want to just add a few more commentaries. So that the Megillah is read. The early authorities ask, why does the Mishnah state the Megillah is read and not we read the Megillah? So the wording is it should say that the Hebrew would be Megillah Nikreis is read, but it should say we read, or Koirim. It should say Megillah Koirim, we read it. So the Ritva, we're going to be introduced to a few more commentaries that we didn't have in Sanhedrin. Evidently, from what I'm seeing so far, the Ritva has a lot to say. The Rashba, these are people we didn't see the commentaries of the Ritva and the Rashba so much in Sanhedrin. These were all Rishonim that lived in around a little after the Rambam's times. Most of them lived in Spain. The Ritva, I believe, lived in Spain. The Rashba for sure lived in Spain. Bruce maybe knows there's a family in Seattle, in Seward Park, called the Ben Aderet family. They're direct descendants from the Rashba, Reb Shlomo Ben Aderet. So these are the commentaries we're going to see more in the Megillah. So the Ritva explains that the Mishnah uses this formulation because the obligation that applies to each individual is not to read the Megillah, but rather to hear the Megillah. So the mitzvah is, which is an important emphasis, the Ritva is saying the obligation of the person is to hear the Megillah being read. Obviously, you could hear it by reading it, but you have no obligation to read it. Some suggest that this wording is used to teach us there's no obligation to read the Megillah on all of these days. Rather, the Megillah is read in each location only on these days. Meaning, if we would say Megillah, Korim Megillah, would mean that we read it each of these days. Nikreis means the Hebrew would kind of make it more clear that it's read on one of these 5 days. Lo pachas v'lo yoser means not earlier or nor later. The phrase literally means not less or not more. Right? So I said the wording is not right. It should say lo lifnei v'lo la'acher. So what's the lo pachas v'lo yoser? So the commentaries understand this is referring here to the number of days on which the Megillah is read. Ritva says. The author of the Rokeach notes that there's an allusion to this in the fact that the word Purim appears 5 times, like I mentioned before in the book of Esther, corresponding to the 5 days established by the sages to read the Megillah. The author of Rishon LeZion writes that the key elements here are the words not later. If the Megillah was not read in its proper time, there's no possibility to make it up afterwards. Okay. Now he's going to go into the discussion of Mimais Yeshua Benun. Why do we establish the days, the walled cities? Again, till today, I don't know exactly, but for sure Jerusalem reads on the 15th. If you're in Jerusalem for Purim, everyone knows all the laws of the complications, because it's very likely you could be in Tel Aviv You could be in Tel Aviv on the morning, the night, and by day you could go drive to Jerusalem. You could drive very simply within 30, 40 minutes and be from outside the walled city to the inside the walled city. And how far does the walled city expand? Today, Jerusalem is already all the way in Har Nof, right? Anyone who knows Yerushalayim. So that's the kind of the end of Jerusalem, Har Nof, and then you have Hadassah Hospital, right? And you have Mount Scopus. You have places that you can't even see the wall. Mount Scopus, you can see the wall. But you have places of Yerushalayim today that, and if you wait another 5 years, Beit Zayit, they're almost, and Motza are going to be part of Yerushalayim. I was walking to synagogue about a year ago, Shul, and I met this couple. They asked me where the Kotel is. An Israeli couple. I said, "So you've never been to the Kotel?" He goes, "We don't go often." I said, "Where do you live?" He says, Beit Vegan, Beit Vegan. Beit Vegan is next to opposite Har Herzl, which is the military cemetery. Unfortunately, people have been recently, all the soldiers that were killed in the war. So opposite Yad Vashem, or next to Yad Vashem. So the museum of the Holocaust Museum. So today that's part of Yerushalayim. And you have way past that. You have all the way past to Hadassah Hospital, Kiryat Menachem, etc. And he told me when they were growing up, Beit Vegan was not part of Jerusalem. It was its own little village outside Jerusalem, because Jerusalem kind of ended by Shaare Tzedek Hospital, or before, by Nayot, and there was kind of a forest in between. But today Jerusalem's expanding. So how far does the Jerusalem expand for the 15th? Not everyone agrees about that till today. Okay, so it says like this: the main reason that the status of the city as walled or unwalled depends upon the times of Joshua is to show honor to Eretz Yisrael. So like I said, why? In those days, meaning in the days of Achashverosh, the cities of Israel were unwalled cities because of the destruction of the temple. Yet it would not be befitting to consider them as having a status of unwalled towns for the purpose of the reading of the Megillah, because Eretz Yisrael is more special. How could you have Shushan celebrating on the 15th? It'd be like New York City having something special, more special than Jerusalem today. It wouldn't be appropriate. Therefore, the status of each city is determined based on whether it was a walled city in times of Joshua, son of Nun, means the successor of Moshe, even if the wall was not standing presently. Again, the wall we have today is not a wall that was in the times of even the Second Temple. It's a wall that was put up only 500 years ago, which means to say about 1,500 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. This is also the understanding in the Jerusalem Talmud, not just in our Talmud, meaning the Babylonian Talmud, as well as the Rambam. Some suggest that since it was Joshua who began the process of wiping out Amalek. Okay, so what is one of the stories of Purim? One of the stories of Purim is that we deal with Haman. Haman is a descendant of Amalek, very much connected to our Torah portion of these weeks, because Eliphaz, who the Rashi tells us robbed Yaakov of all his possessions, who was the son of Esav, the grandson of Yitzchak, is the father of Amalek, the great adversary of the Jewish people. Who was the first one to face a battle of Amalek? Was Joshua in the beginning of Parshas Beshalach, end of Parshas Beshalach. After we crossed the Red Sea, before we went to Matan Torah, there was the first battle with Amalek. We had another one later. So Joshua was the first to fight Amalek. So in respect to that, that's the beginning of the confrontation with Amalek, which culminated, which was completed, really came to its sea in the story of Purim. So therefore, that connection is why we connect the walled city. The determination of a walled and unwalled city with respect to Purim was made dependent upon this time. The Ran, Ritva, Miktam, I think, Meiri, citing the Medrash. Okay. So how does this work? The Mishnah continues. Keitzat. Let's say the 14th of the month of Adar, which is the day of Purim for unwalled cities, would fall out on a Monday. So how do you read the Megillah? Kfarim, the villages, Vayaris, and the cities, Gedalas, large cities, Karim Baibiyam, they read on that day. It means the 14th Monday, so everyone's happy because it's a gathering day on the day. Umakafes Chaima, what about a city that's surrounded with a wall? When would they read the Megillah? Again, the Gemara, the Mishnah is talking about when you read the Megillah. But like I said a few times, the 15th you celebrate Purim, the whole Purim on the 15th, not just the Megillah. Umakafes Chaima Lemachar would be the day after, which would be Tuesday, because they read on the 15th. Chali is B'shlishi. What about if the 14th falls out on Tuesday or Wednesday. So Kfar Makdim Yom Knisa, the villages do it on Monday. So the Monday would be either the 13th or the 12th. Vayaris and the village cities, Gedalis Karim by Biyam, again, they read it on the day, Tuesday or Wednesday, which is the 14th in Mekafis Chama, and a walled city would read it Machar on either Thursday or Wednesday, depending on when the 14th falls out. Chali is Bechamishi. What happens if the 14th falls out on a Thursday? So Kfarim, the villages, Vayaris, Gedalis, and the big cities, Karim by Biyam, again, they read on the 14th itself. Mekafis Chama Machar and walled cities will read it on Friday, which is the 15th. Now, what happens if Purim falls out on Erev Shabbos, on Friday? So then you have Thursday night, Friday. Again, that can happen. And you have the Megillah has to be read. So Kfarim Makdim Miyam Knisa. The villages come to read it on Thursday, because Friday they don't come to the cities. Vayaris Gedailais, the big cities. Also, now you have to include the walled cities, Karim by BM on the 14th. So now is the first time that the walled city has to also change its date, because we're not allowed to read the Megillah on Shabbos. The same reason we don't shake lulav and esrog on Shabbos, and the same reason we don't blow shofar on Shabbos, is the same reason we don't read the Megillah on Shabbos, because a person may come and carry the Megillah, and you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. So therefore, you can't read the Megillah on Shabbos. So when would you read it if Shabbos falls out on the 15th? You'd read for the people on the 15th. The walled cities would also read it Thursday night, Friday. So Rashi says, Chol Arba Asal Yes Be'erev Shabbos. What happens if the 14th falls out on a Friday? Ayaris and Mekavos Chaim Mekarim by Miyaim. The big cities and the walled cities read it on Friday. She'ein Kriyas and Megillah b'Shabbos. We can't read the Megillah on Shabbos. Why? Because you may carry it. And you can't carry in Shabbos. Again, the same reason we don't do Megillah or Lulav and Esther. So why don't we just read it on Sunday? To have it kind of a separate day. Then you would be reading on the 16th. And the verse, we have another verse that says, you're not allowed to go past. So you're not allowed to go past your date. So the only thing you could do is to go early. Because the Megillah itself says you can't go past, so therefore you have to always go a day earlier. Now, what happens if the 14th, again, our calendar doesn't allow for this. So this scenario would not happen in our calendar system because the 14th never falls out on Shabbos. But let's say Chali is b'Shabbos. Let's say again, we have to remember the Jewish calendar we learned this in Rosh Hashanah. The Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. The actual lunar month is 29 and a half, about a little over 29 and a half days. The problem is we don't have half days. So sometimes we have 30 days of the month, and sometimes we have 29 days of the month. For instance, the month of Tishrei was 30 days, and the month of Cheshvan was 29 days, right? We just celebrated Rosh Chodesh, it was only one day. So we have sometimes, and the system basically, as we learned, is there's never more than 8 and 4. Means you can't have if you do every month 29, so you're going to end up missing days of the year. So, but some years have more leap months than others. So we always have a few months that we could play with, where we add a 30th or take away a 30th. So we could always maneuver one day to maneuver that the 14th shouldn't fall on Shabbos. It's not so complicated. And it goes with other things that we don't have. We don't have Yom Kippur on a Sunday. Yom Kippur never falls out on Sunday. You never have Saturday Erev Yom Kippur. So let's say this, Chol Yis b'Shabbos. What happens if the 14th, but in the days of temple times, it could have happened. Because then there was no set calendar. And they had whenever the witnesses came and said, this is when they saw the new moon. So Chol Yis b'Shabbos, if the 14th falls on Shabbos. So Kfarim Vayaris Gedailas. So now the villages and the big cities can't read it on Shabbos, because now they're reading Megillah on Shabbos. So Makdim and Mekarim Liyam Knisa. Everyone goes back to Thursday. Meaning even we don't read on Friday. Because in theory, we should read Friday for the big cities, Thursday for the villages, and Sunday for the 15th people. But no, the 14th people go back to Thursday. And Sunday is for the walled cities. What happens if the 14th falls out on a Sunday? So this is the scenario of the 11th of the month. So Kfar Makdimim Liyam Knisa. So the villages read on Thursday. So we have Sunday is the 14th, so Shabbos is the 13th, Friday is the 12th, and Thursday is the 11th. So that's the only scenario that we would read on the 11th. And the big cities will read it on Sunday, and the walled cities will read it L'machar, which is on a Monday. Let's see quickly Rashi. So then the question is, what happens if it falls out Cholis Achar Shabbos? So then the villages read it on Monday, on Thursday, which is Yud Aleph. We never find anything earlier than the 11th day. You can never do it. You can't read it if, let's say, Purim is on Sunday. You can't read it the Monday before. You can't go more than one gathering day. So the earliest, the largest separation between the gathering day and the 14th would be a Sunday of the 14th, which brings the gathering day all the way back to Thursday, which is the 11th of the month. But we can't go all the way back to Monday because also we don't go earlier. So that's basically gives us the 5 days of the reading of the Megillah. Before we go to the Gemara, I just want to mention a few things here. Because again, we're not going to have a lot of commentary on the Masechta, so we might as well take advantage when we do. Again, in the discussion of why we go into Yeshua ben Nun, why don't we go from the days of Moshe Rabbeinu? That why don't we? It means why if we're establishing to give respect to Eretz Yisrael, we could have gone a little further to the days of Moshe. Why is it Joshua? So then the days because Moshe didn't conquer the land. The Joshua conquered the land. Moshe only conquered the east side of the river, which was later to be part of Ruvain and Gad and half of Menashe. Again, there is a question. It says like this, that Kasav Ritva, the Ritva writes that seemingly that doesn't make a difference if there's a walled city in Israel or outside of Israel, inside of Israel, outside of Israel. It means if we know for sure that there's a city, say in Turkey or anywhere in Asia today, again, Jewish communities live everywhere, that there was a walled cities that were walled in the days of Joshua, theoretically they should be able to read on the 15th of the month. We don't find that actually. Maybe we don't know if there was walled cities. But according to the Ritva, and he says so to the Ran and the Ramban, all agree. These are all Rishonim in the times of around the Rambam's times, Rashi's times in Spain. Shevirai Mishami, they bring proof from the Jerusalem Talmud that would be the case. But there are those who hold that it's only in Eretz Yisrael. It means even halachically, if we were to know of a walled city in Chutz La'aretz, outside Eretz Yisrael, they would not read on the 15th. Okay, that's basically some opinions here. Another thing is it says over here, the main question is that's going to come up over here is there's a halacha of lois to do. There's a law you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to make a good day a good day. So you're not allowed to divide. I mean, although today people would say, "What are you talking about?" There's Sephardi, Ashkenazi. There's so many groups of Jewish people. But there's really a violation about separating that there should be groups of people. Leis is going to do. You're not allowed to make a goodis, that people have different customs. It's not so simple that, once upon a time, people lived in different areas. The Sephardi Jews lived in Sephardic lands and the Ashkenazic Jews lived in Ashkenazi lands. But today, especially in Eretz Yisrael, in big cities like New York, or even Seattle, where there's a mix of communities of Sephardic Ashkenazi, but it's officially to set up that there should be different customs, it's not so simple. It's a violation of the law that says Leis is going to do. So the question is, how is it that Purim has a holiday where officially there's different groups that celebrate different days? Some people celebrate on the 15th, some people celebrate on the 14th. Again, the whole Purim is celebrated on the 15th. So the answer given is a few interesting answers. One answer given is that the initially the real people that celebrated Purim were only the unwalled cities. The concern of the decree of Haman seemed, according to some opinions, that the threat was more to the unwalled cities. They were unprotected. The metropolitans, like Shushan, were maybe less threatened, although Haman was there, and that's where the decree was. But it seems like the Jewish people felt more vulnerable in the unwalled cities. So they didn't need Mordechai to tell them to make a holiday. They felt so threatened that as soon as the decree was over, they made a holiday. The people in the walled cities, they didn't feel so much a miracle. So because they didn't feel the miracle so strong, so when Mordechai set it up, he set it up according to the time of when they rested. But there's that's one opinion. And also the next opinion is that's not a problem, a violation of Balais is going to do of not making groups. Because again, we're celebrating when they rested. They stopped fighting on the 14th, they stopped fighting on the 15th, even though we couldn't make a universal date to celebrate the victory. But initially, it was always established like that. So, Leis is going to do really means to separate from a mitzvah. But here, the mitzvah itself is rabbinic. And when the rabbis established it, they established it as so that there should be a difference between a walled city and an unwalled city because of how the celebration was at the first time or how the victories were the first time. This is a summary of all the opinions that were brought up about this subject. There are Akiv Eger and others that bring this question. He also quotes that there's opinion. I just want to quote a few opinions. There's an opinion that says that I think the Ramban says, or the Ran says, that this provision that we made for the people that gather to read the Megillah on the 14th, on the 11th, 12th, and 13th is only the day Megillah, because they didn't gather at night anyways. So it means they read the Megillah different times in the morning and the evening. So they read by day on the 11th, but by night they had to figure out either whatever they were going to do, but they would read it on the on the day itself. That's an opinion brought down by the Ran. There's also the problem is we read Rashi. Rashi quotes that the reason why the villagers needed to go into the cities was because they didn't know how to read it. That's Rashi's opinion. The Rambam seemingly and others say, they didn't actually go, it was the day of gathering, but they didn't read the Megillah in the cities. The villagers would gather together. Means there's two problems here. One is that they wanted a gathering of 10 people, a minyan, they wanted to get together. But they didn't, it doesn't say anywhere that they had to get together in the city. That's seemingly the idea, because Rashi quotes that they're coming to the city anyways for judgment, for other things. But the other commentaries say no, that actually the day of the gathering is the day that they would go to the cities, but they would gather themselves in the villages and they didn't read in the city. So it's not like they're dividing where one shul was reading one day, one shul was reading the next day. And also because there's some opinions that hold that someone who doesn't have an obligation cannot read for you. You can't listen to the Megillah from someone who doesn't have an obligation. That's a big question all the time. Can you read the Megillah for someone if you don't have to hear the Megillah? That's why they make the brachos. So the question is, if the person is reading the Megillah doesn't have to read the Megillah, because for them it's not the holiday. The holiday's on the 14th, not on the 12th, 11th, or 13th. Could they be moitzi, the person who's listening to it earlier? So according to some commentaries, the whole idea of the gathering was a day of gathering, but not in the cities. It was gathered inside the villages. Okay, let's just see if we finish off over here these ideas. Also, the idea is also, I just want to say, again, when I said that when would they read Amalek? So they would read Amalek also on Shabbos. They wouldn't read, means if on the 14th, if we read the 14th would fall out on Shabbos. Or today in Israel, Eretz Yisrael, if the 15th falls out on Shabbos, we don't read Amalek on Thursday. You only hear the Megillah on Thursday, but the reading of the Amalek is on Shabbos. So there's certain things we do on Shabbos. Okay, I mean, I just want to say, there's one thing I wanted to say. It says over here, about the poor people. The idea is for the tzedakah. Where did I see that? Hold on a second. There was a concern that if the people came in, that the people the poor people usually are the ones who lived in the villages, and therefore they needed tzedakah, the charity that was given on Purim. Maybe that's later. All right, I guess it's somewhere else. I saw that. Okay, let's just go a little further in the Gemara. The Gemara says like this: Megillah Nikreis b'chadash or minolan. How do we know? What's the proof that you could read the Megillah on the 11th? It means again, what would be the scenario if Purim falls out on Sunday, on the 14th? So then they would gather on the day of gathering would be on the Thursday, which is the 11th. So the Gemara says minolan kedabeinin l'meimer l'kamon. We saw. What do you mean? How do we know? It's like it's going to be explained. The rabbis were lenient when it comes to the villages. So here from the Gemara itself, it doesn't seem clearly if they're reading on the day of that we want them to come into the city, so they should bring the water. It means the people in the villages were not just people that came to the village the villagers were coming to the city to take, but they were also giving, because it was who brings in the water, who brings in the food are the people who live in the villages. Where are the farms? The farms are in the villages. There's no farms in the city. So they're very fundamental to the existence of the city, right? Melech l'seved l'sada nevad. The king needs the field. The people in the field are the people of the villages. So they would come in on the Thursdays and Mondays to bring water and food for the people in the cities, and therefore the rabbis were lenient for them to allow for that to be a time, either according to the Rambam, that they gathered together, or they gathered in the cities and they heard the Megillah. Let's see how Rashi learns. Gemara says, "Hachi arsinim minalan kidabeinin lameim lekaman. V'hachi perush minalan diyudal vidbeis yudgimel chazi likriya diyudal v'tzvav hu dichsi b'kra." The question is, how do we know that you could read on the 11th, 12th, and 13th? The verse that we quoted in our intro says that there's villages of 14th and the 15th for walled and non-walled cities. Where do we ever see this provision for the 11th, 12th, and 13th? The Gemara answers, you're asking a question? It's not an obligation that the villagers must listen to it on the 11th, 12th, and 13th. The villager cannot have their own shul and daven and make a minyan if they could read on the 14th. It's a kula. The rabbis were lenient because they live in the villages. And let's say, according to Rashi, they're going to be coming in on Monday and Thursday to bringing provisions, water and food. So the rabbis are giving them a leniency that they can if they want to. There's no obligation. The Megillah is telling us when's the obligation to read. The walled cities read it on the 15th, the unwalled cities read it on the 14th. And on top of that, the rabbis made a provision for there to be a leniency for the villagers to do it on a Monday and Thursday. So Rashi learns that here a different explanation. That not because they're going to come in on Monday and Thursdays and bring food, so therefore we wanted them to continue to bring the food on their appropriate time. Actually, that the rabbis were being lenient. They have there's a thing in Yerushalayim called I don't know, maybe it's only Yerushalayim. I heard in Yerushalayim called Terach Minyan. It says Vayashkem Avram Baboker. Avram wakes up early in the morning, and from here we have the Netz Chevra, the people who like to daven with the rising of the sun. So there's people who daven in Yerushalayim. It's a big deal. That people like to daven with in Seattle would be very difficult because rising of the sun in the winter would be very late, and rising of the sun of the summer would be very early. But Yerushalayim doesn't get too early, it doesn't get too late. The earliest it will be about 5 in the morning, and the latest is about 6:30 in the morning. So you have the 5:30 minyan, the 5 o'clock minyan, but that's Vayashkem Avram. Avram wakes up in the morning. Terach wakes up even earlier. Why? Because you have people that have obligations. Let's say a moel. The person who performs the circumcision. So he has to be ready on the road to be able to do early morning circumcisions. So usually the moyalim daven in Terach's minyans. They're davening even before the sun rises, especially in winter when the sun rises later. So the same thing over here. So there's a provision for the people who have jobs. They daven really early. Same thing over here. The rabbis wanted that the people from the villages, that they are the people that supply the food. When are they going to hear the Megillah? If they have to hear the Megillah, they're not going to be coming into the cities to provide food for the holiday. So the rabbis let them do it a day or two earlier, so you won't be busy with the Megillah, and you could make sure that you bring in all the foods that are needed for the truckers. They have to bring the food in. Here's Rabbi Steinsaltz says this Minalan Tosfos in Zvachim 89a, I believe. Aren't they learning Zvachim? I think in Daf Yomi now. Asks why the Gemara astonished about the question. From where do we derive this halacha? Even if the derivation is explained in a Breita, not all the Breitas were well known. I mean, even if we know that the Breita says that we have to do 11, 12, 13, I mean, like, why is everyone so excited? We know, and how do we know? Like, as if everyone should know. And therefore, it is appropriate to ask and to provide the answer from the Breita. The Rashba, again, here we have the Rashba, quotes Tosfos, as answering that the Gemara's astonishment is based on the fact that the sages asked for a source for the halacha concerning the days of which the Megillah is read, but did not ask for the source of halacha in the next clause in the Mishnah, which states that the village advanced their reading to the day of assembly. Means, how do we know it's the day of assembly? Means, how do we know that it's earlier is one thing. How do we know it's the day of assembly? The fact that they did not ask the source for the second halacha indicates that they knew that their sages had allowed the villagers to read the Megillah earlier, in which case the question about the source for the first clause is unnecessary, as the answer is the same. Some write that the question from where do we derive this halacha usually refers to something that is not explicitly written in the Bible, but is alluded to in the text. Here the Gemara asks, why search for an allusion in the Bible for something that is rabbinic enactment? The whole thing is rabbinic. So why would we be looking? Usually you say, basically, Minolan is usually a question, where's the Makar Midaraisa? Where's the biblical reference? But the whole thing is not biblical, so why are we asking Minolan? Let's go further. So the Gemara says, Anan hachi kamrina. Michte. Kuli anje knesses agdoila takninu. This whole holiday was instituted by the members of the Great Assembly. If you want to say that the members of the Great Assembly, and Mordechai was one of the members of the Great Assembly, right? The members of the Great Assembly were a group that kind of survived the diaspora in the early days of the Second Temple. What did we learn in Perek Avos? That Shimon HaTzadik, Shimon the Righteous, which was the high priest in the times of Alexander the Great, was the Mishayaru from the last of the members of the Great Assembly. The members of the Great Assembly included the prophets Chagai, Malachi, Mordechai, were part of, I think even Daniel was a member of the Great Assembly. So they were the Sanhedrin. We have today the Knesset. That's trying to be a duplicate of the members of the Great Assembly. If you want to say that the members of the Great Assembly only established the 13th and the 14th and the 15th, also Rabbanan, and came the later rabbis, the Akrit Akant, they changed what the members of the Great Assembly established. The Takinu, Anshe Knesset Agdayla, they changed what the members of the Great Assembly established, and they added 11, 12, and 13. But we learned in Bezin Yachel, Levatel Divrei Bezin Chaveiroi, Elim Ken, Gadol Men Mechachma Minyan. A later court cannot uproot or nullify a decree of a previous court unless they are greater than them in wisdom and numbers. And the members of the Great Assembly were the most wise of all. So how could they have added to that 11, 12, and 13? So the Rashi says like this. The fact that we asked the question, where do we know from? This is the question. So he says like this, from this side, the fact that the rabbis made that the villages can read earlier, so therefore we must assume that the members of the Great Assembly, which were the days of Esther and Mordechai, and they established the holiday of Purim and the reading of the Megillah, they also must have established that you could read it on the 12th, 13th, and 14th. Where do we see that? If you want to say that the rabbis in the Megillah only means the members of the Great Assembly only established the 13th and the 14th and the 15th, how could the later rabbis, how could, if it means to say, what the question what the Gemara is asking is, where do we see that the members of the Great Assembly, meaning within the text, we allow, in the Megillah text, it allows for earlier reading? Because if the members of the Great Assembly only established the 14th and the 15th, means to say that the rabbis who came after the members of the Great Assembly changed that and added the 11th, 12th, and 13th. And they're not allowed to because they're not greater than the members of the Great Assembly. El Pshita Inu Tikkun is simply we have to assume that the members of the Great Assembly did establish it. Because they did establish 12, 13, and 14 to be days, 11, 12, and 13 to be days. Esther, we have to find a hint to that in the Megillah. And therefore the question is, where do we see in the Megillah a hint? Because the Megillah only mentions the 14th and the 15th. But there must be a wording in the Megillah that hints to this allowance for the 11th, 12th, and 13th. So he says, Rav Steinsaltz says like this: the members of the Great Assembly, the exact role and composition of the group known as the members of the Great Assembly is unclear. All right. According to the introductory Mishnah in Perek Avos, the members of the Great Assembly received the oral tradition from the prophets and served as a link in the chain of transmission of the Torah going back to Moses. It goes, Anshe Knesset Agdola, and then it says from them they gave it to Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik gave it to Antichos Ishsocho, who gave it to Yosef ben Yozer, and then we have all the way down to Hillel Shammai, all the way down, the Rambam continues all the way down to the end of the Talmud. So the members of the Great Assembly are part of the chain of tradition. So going back to Moses at Mount Sinai, the assembly served as a religious leadership during the Second Temple period, really started before, in the time of the end of the exile. The last of the prophets, including Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are identified as being part of the group, together with Mordechai of Megillah Esther. Some people say Mordechai himself was Haggai, but there's different people that we know of the members of the Great Assembly. Definitely the last of the prophets, and Mordechai. If I'm not sure, I think Daniel was also one of them. Ein bezin yochel levatel. Okay, now he goes and he quotes the Rambam. There's a machlekes about this. The law that what does it mean? Because we have a lot of hakanas today. There's this idea that and I think we had it in Sanhedrin, that for the rabbis to change something that was instituted, you have to have greater numbers and greater wisdom. The question is what kind of established fact? There's certain facts that allow for time to change it, and certain facts don't. So he says like this: if a court issues a decree made an enactment or established a practice and is spread throughout the Jewish people. So here the Rambam quotes that it has to be something that's accepted by the Jewish people. There have been things, for instance, Ezra established the idea of going to the mikvah for men. And we don't find that you had to go to the mikvah even to learn Torah. That you couldn't learn Torah without going to the mikvah. I mean, anytime you have a seminal discharge, you can't open up a sefer and start learning without going to the mikvah. That was a takonish that the people couldn't keep. So it wasn't accepted. It didn't spread. The people couldn't keep it. It was too difficult. And that's why till today, the halach is not that you have to go to the mikvah before you learn Torah. It's better that you should. And of course, like the Alter Rebbe quotes, better to daven before you go to the mikvah, brought down by Talmud Rabbeinu Yonah. But the idea of learning of the takana, that wasn't accepted. Another court cannot cancel the enactment of the first court unless the latter court is superior in wisdom and in number. Even if the reason for the edict no longer applies, it is not automatically annulled. Rather, it must be actively annulled by a court. In the case of an earlier and later court that both consist of 71 judges, superiority in the number means that the number of sages who are not members of the court who accept the court's ruling. It means the question is obviously, what does it mean, greater numbers? You can't get more than 71, right? The largest Sanhedrin is 71. So how could you have more than 71? So the idea is that there's the rabbis outside of the court that are not members of the Sanhedrin. Those numbers that accept the ruling of the Sanhedrin in a way that everyone's accepted, those are the numbers that establish if the lesser court or a later court could overrule it. Exceeds the number who originally accepted the ruling of the previous court. Meaning to say, if the second Sanhedrin has a larger group of Talmidei Chachamim that support them to annul it, then they can annul it. This is the definition of the Rambam. Again, I'm not going to go into. There's others who have different. There's a lot of discussion about this, about the Ravid who argues on this, and the Smag of the Rashba about this question of how do we establish who is how do we uproot this? We're going to stop here. I don't understand what this has to do with anything, and I think this is a mistake in the printing of the Steinsaltz. I didn't see anything about a nin, unless I'm missing something. A nin means a great grandson or an offspring. In Hebrew today, when you want to say great grandchild, you say nin. I'm not sure. So the Gemara is going to continue. We're going to continue next week with the Gemara is going to bring down the different places where we learn, where we know in the Megillah that we have this provision that we could read on the 11th, 12th, and 13th. Okay, Chevra. I know we did a bit slow. In the beginning, we were going to try to go a little slower because a lot of the laws that are around Megillah are in this early part of the Gemara. So try to get in as much information as we can. Otherwise, welcome to the new Masechta. Hashem, we will see you all next week. Tov, thanks for joining.